Labour's Lisa Nandy, Secretary of State for Culture, Media, and Sport, faced a fierce grilling from anchor Martin Lewis over the government's handling of winter fuel payments, and the exchange did not go well for her. Lewis pressed hard on the fact that hundreds of thousands of the poorest pensioners, earning under £11,400 a year, will be left without support because they do not qualify for pension credit. He accused Labour of effectively taking money out of vulnerable people's hands, a move that charities like Age UK and Citizens Advice have strongly condemned. With over 780,000 pensioners set to lose out on the £300 payment, Lewis argued there were practical systems that could be put in place to prevent this outcome, making it difficult for Nandy to defend the policy. His frustration was clear, pointing out the absurdity of forcing society's most vulnerable to shoulder the burden of Labour's financial missteps. Ever since the party stumbled into a £22 billion black hole in public finances, it seems their strategy has been to patch the gaps at the expense of ordinary families. With poorly planned economic choices and questionable priorities, Labour appears to be leaving everyday people to pay the price for their mistakes. Surely, Lewis implied, leadership should mean finding solutions that protect those who need help most, not stripping them of vital support to cover the consequences of bad planning. The crisis in public finances is not some distant challenge, it is happening now, with £22 billion of spending this year alone hidden by the party opposite. If ignored, this shortfall would push the budget deficit up by 25% in a single year. But beyond the numbers lies a deeper injustice. Why are pensioners, the very people who need the most support, being treated with such cold indifference? As winter approaches, cutting their last lifeline in the form of fuel allowances is nothing short of cruel. Starmer's dismissive approach leaves them vulnerable, when compassion and leadership are most needed. To defend the policy, ministers argue that winter fuel payments, previously untargeted, are now being focused on those most in need, with pension credit recipients continuing to receive support and efforts being made to expand access to pension credit and align it with housing benefit. Yet, after 14 years of Tory misrule that nearly drove the country into collapse, many had turned to Labour hoping for renewal and recovery. Instead, they find themselves facing the same failures all over again, with leaders making excuses rather than bold changes. The government insists that reforms are necessary to plug the £22 billion economic black hole and to target aid more effectively, but for those left out in the cold, it feels less like a solution and more like a betrayal. The government's decision to restrict universal eligibility for the winter fuel payment has caused outrage, particularly among pensioners. Since 1997, over 10 million elderly and disabled people have relied on a modest £300 payment to help keep their homes warm during the harshest months. Now, with Labour pulling back support, many are asking how much more hardship the government expects older people to endure. Protesters flooding the streets are proof of just how disconnected Lisa's claims are from the reality families face. Pensioners feel disrespected, blindsided by a policy that was never mentioned in the Labour manifesto, and frustrated by the lack of any convincing explanation as to why it had to happen this year. In one of the world's richest economies, critics argue, taking from pensioners feels like outright theft. Many believe this isn't about fairness at all but about political maneuvering, what some call pork barrel politics, where Starmer rewards those who backed him while punishing groups, like older voters, who largely supported the Conservatives. The polls reinforce this suspicion, showing that most Tory support in the last election came from people over 50, raising fears that the policy is a form of political payback. While ministers point to efforts to boost pension credit, claiming a 115% rise in uptake in recent months thanks to Liz Kendall's department, concern remains for those just above the eligibility threshold, who are now left without meaningful support. The government insists it is protecting those at the very bottom of the state pension system, but when you look at the state of affairs, it's hard not to suspect something questionable. Polling suggests that much of Tory support in the last election came from voters over 50, raising the uncomfortable question of whether this policy shift is Starmer's way of punishing the older generation, a form of political payback disguised as fiscal responsibility. The controversy deepens with Cabinet Minister Liz Kendall, who has been branded a hypocrite for helping remove winter fuel payments for 10 million pensioners, while simultaneously having nearly £4,000 of her own second home heating bills covered by taxpayers. As more than 100,000 pensioners face the real risk of falling into poverty, Lisa Nandy continues to argue that some people simply don't deserve even minimal support to get through winter, an argument both staggering and incomprehensible. But the real flaw lies deeper. Before even debating those above the eligibility threshold, what about those below it? Around 780,000 people qualify for pension credit and therefore should receive the winter fuel payment of up to £300, yet many have already missed out on last year's cost of living assistance. Despite government claims of improvement, the system remains broken. An extra £15 uplift amounts to only about £20,000 a month in additional support, meaning it could take 4 years before all eligible pensioners actually receive what they are owed. These are the poorest pensioners, living on less than £11,400 a year, and they remain the hardest to reach. Without direct letters, targeted outreach, or practical support, they are effectively abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. Martin finally reached his breaking point after hearing yet again about Labour's so-called sensitive approach and supposed concern for ordinary people. To him, it was nothing more than empty promises sugar-coated with lies. What shocked him most, however, was discovering how many freebies Keir Starmer had accepted. As someone who had spent his life in public service, Martin was appalled. He had never taken a penny he didn't earn and couldn't understand why a man of Starmer's position, with a generous salary, should accept clothes and gifts when pensioners like himself often had to buy second-hand from charity shops. His disillusionment ran deep, especially as a lifelong Labour voter. What made matters worse were the heartbreaking stories he kept hearing. People so cold they slept beside their pets for warmth, hiding reduced food in their baskets out of shame, too proud to ask for help despite having worked and paid into the system their entire lives. Labour, he felt, had misled the public during the election, and now, just months into their rule, people were struggling to survive the biting winter. "Well done, Starmer," he said bitterly. His frustration boiled over in the discussion, even as officials tried to reassure him that they were working with charities and organizations to reach those in need. But Martin's challenge was sharp. Those who need the most help are always the hardest to reach, so what real protection will they ever get? "In fairness, you said to me, you're not writing bloody letters." Well, we are, and I wanted to explain that, because I don't want anyone to think for a moment that we're leaving people high and dry. It's difficult to watch as so many are left out in the cold, and now Lisa is scrambling to defend herself. She presents herself with confidence, almost smugly, as if a few letters could possibly fix the suffering created by cuts to support and heating allowances. That simply won't do. She insists they're working with councils across the country, pointing to Wigan as an example, where letters are being sent, vulnerable groups identified, and even door-to-door visits arranged to ensure no one slips through the cracks. She argues it's better handled at the community level than by central government, but promises to adjust if needed, claiming the evidence so far is positive. Yet Martin isn't convinced. He presses hard, are all councils really doing this? Because the data tells another story. Pension credit claims may have risen from 20,000 to 40,000 a month, but with 780,000 eligible, the gap remains enormous. To reach them all this year would require an exponential surge that simply won't happen. The reality, he argues, is that hundreds of thousands of the poorest pensioners, many living on less than £11,400 and some struggling with dementia, will be left without the winter fuel payment. Age UK and others agree. And in that moment, Martin delivers Lisa Nandy perhaps the toughest reality check of her career. Her face says it all, as she's left without a solid response. Once again, we see a Labour MP making weak excuses for their leader, following the same predictable pattern since the party entered Downing Street, quick to defend, but offering no real solutions. When pressed, the response was to extend the application deadline for the winter fuel allowance until April next year, supposedly ensuring that even those who miss the initial outreach or fail to respond in time can still apply and receive backdated payments. The MP insisted that this was done to reassure people they need not worry about heating their homes immediately, claiming it was evidence of their determination to help. Yet to many, this sounded like just another empty promise, raising doubts about when Labour's false assurances will finally stop. Martin Lewis sharply confronted Lisa Nandy, criticising her for making tone-deaf remarks toward those unfairly denied their allowance this year. At last, someone is calling Labour to account for their harsh treatment of vulnerable pensioners, particularly the elderly and disabled, who have been let down. They have created a serious mess, and it is long overdue that they face the criticism they deserve.